Afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's episode of Getting In, a college coach conversation. Now, if you're watching this on any of our social media channels, you'll see that I've got two guests with me today, and you'll recognize one of them, Sally Ganga, who is another of the hosts of the show. Hey, Sally.
Hey, Ian, how you doing? Thanks for having me on today.
Glad to have you on. And then we've got Shannon Vasconcelos, who's also a frequent guest of the show, and she's here for the duration of the show as well. Hey, Shannon.
Hi, Ian. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. And, we all did our homework, right? I kind of like, this is getting in extra credit. I wish we had sort of a special theme song that we could play for the extra credit version of the show. But this is a time in sort of, at least in the admission cycle, where things shift from one set of students to another. And we thought we would take this opportunity to read a book together and then come on and discuss it with anybody else who's interested who has read it. And so the book, for those who don't know or didn't hear on a previous show, is called Who Gets In and Why? A Year Inside College Admissions, and it's by Jeffrey Selingo. And Selingo is an education reporter for the New York Times. And he's put together this book that I would say is very well researched. Over the last few years, he has been inside admission offices, has talked to students, has done a lot of investigation on sort of how college admissions and college finance works and what the effects are on both institutions and the students who are seeking to be accepted to those institutions. And what we want to do today is just discuss some of the things that we found interesting in this book. If you've read it, you can follow along with us. If you haven't read it but would like to, our podcasts are available for download, so you can listen to them at your leisure. And maybe you'll press pause, go pick up a copy or get it at the library and dig right in. So what we're going to do is we've got three segments we want to talk about today. The first segment, we're going to talk a little bit about sort of how he advises students and families approach the research process and the selection process. The second segment, we're going to talk a little bit about early decision. We might have an axe to grind or two in that particular segment. And then for the third segment, we're going to just talk about our big takeaways of the book, maybe offer a review. I don't know, this isn't a book review necessarily, but we'll talk a little bit about some of the takeaways that we've got from it. So let's kick it off just with thinking about kind of how he advises families to think about this process. And there's a lot of really great info that sort of is sprinkled throughout. Sally, I'll kind of start with you and we'll just open this up for a conversation. What were some things that you found particularly interesting, good about the way that he talks about how families should engage with the college admission process?
I mean, I loved what he had to say. And it's kind of funny because now as I'm sitting here in front of the camera with you, I'm like, wait, did he say that or did I just say that? And I think that he said that because that's something I say every day when I'm on the phone. Yeah. I mean, the biggest message that he has that I kind of like, and he doesn't use these words, but it's kind of like, calm down, everybody. Yeah. Calm down. Yeah. There are options. There are lots of good options. There are not major differences between what happens to you if you go to UPenn or if you go to University of Rochester. So just really like everybody relax is kind of the subtext. But again, maybe that's what I'm reading into it because that's what I always want to say to people.
That sounds like you, Sally. Yeah. Not just because it's coming out of your mouth, but
yeah, exactly.
It's actually just a 2-page book. It just says, just relax.
Relax,
that's all you need.
You have options. So, yeah. But, I think that, where he talks, he really emphasizes like through his examples of different students, he really emphasizes to students having an open mind. And it's kind of cool the way he talks about the students. Like he talks about, I'm trying to remember, passengers and drivers, right?
Yes.
So the passengers are the students who, frankly, I saw a lot of those students when I worked at Whittier. They kind of like apply to the schools that are local. They don't think about it too much. They probably apply later. And then there are the students that are drivers. That's a much smaller percentage of students. And the drivers are the students who are, often they're gunning for the Ivies. They are looking at colleges really early. They can, if you ask them where they want to apply, they know already. They've got a plan in place. But one of the things that's really notable is he makes it clear that their information isn't always valid and that with the drivers, they're often really, really focused on name brand. And there's even an example with a young woman, I think she was applying, I think it was between Penn and Dartmouth for early decision.
Yeah.
And her mom was like, look, I don't know if you want Penn for Penn or you just want UPenn because it's prestigious.
Right.
And so the fact that he kind of addresses that head on is one of the things that I like best about the book. That was something that I really enjoyed reading. Although I will say that it reminded me so much of conversations that I have with my own students that it got a little like stressful.
Lots of them. Lots of them. I think if you're listening to this podcast, you're probably a driver in the process, or your student may be a driver, right? So we should acknowledge that from the get-go. And if you're a frequent listener of this show, you probably have more and better information than a lot of other students have, because we sort of give it to you just transparently in terms of what our experience has to share. I think, Shannon, there's also sort of the sense of like drivers and passengers, and how that dovetails with finance, because he does address quite frequently the prospect of paying for college and how that is a far off concern for the cases he talks about, and then also the students in general, until the time comes that, oh my gosh, I have to pay for this.
I have to pay for this.
How did you react to those sections of the book?
Well, it certainly struck home for me because I talk to people in this position every day, and they are so often, the drivers can get so focused on prestige and ignore the fact whether they can pay for that school or not. And like you were saying, there's the passengers who are sort of don't disengage from the process, don't know much about the process, who are uninformed in one way. And then there are the drivers who feel like they are informed, but in fact tend to be misinformed. And where it comes down to finance, I think that the drivers assume that they're equally likely to get scholarship funding from any school. These are often high achieving students, and they assume they will get scholarships because they have earned scholarships. I'm putting air quotes for those of you who are not watching on the video. They have earned scholarships, so any college will be, as likely to give me scholarships. They have heard that, oh, don't worry about it, nobody pays full price. And I think they've heard that Salingo references, they've heard this in the media. I felt temporarily guilty about that because I probably said this on the show and on media outlets that almost nobody pays full price when you look at the grand scheme of things, the overall landscape. But in fact, the overall landscape is largely lower income folks, number one, who qualify for need-based aid, and also folks attending what they refer to as buyer schools. I hope I'm not saying it in reverse, where they have to recruit students with merit-based scholarships. If you are a high income student applying to only seller schools, is how he refers to them, that don't have to recruit students with discounts, that students are willing to pay full price, you are in fact paying full price for that school. You are one of the few, even though in the grand scheme of things, relatively few students pay full price, you are the very few. So you have to understand that up front. Then I think a lot of drivers don't. And then on the flip side of things, for the passengers in his landscape, there's still lots of misunderstanding about the college finance process, but it presents in a different way in that they often don't believe that they can afford any college at all. They can't afford to go to college, or maybe just their local community college, or maybe state college campus, and they don't realize that they would qualify for a whole lot of financial aid from some of these richer schools, that would give them plenty of money. So I think there's a theme of a lack of transparency, that nobody really knows what's going on in this process, and that certainly presents on the admissions side and on the financial side.
It does. And I just as just to clarify for all our listeners, we're throwing around these terms. We read the book. So drivers in the process are students that are really well informed, relatively speaking, about how the admission process works and proactive about engaging with it. Passengers tend to be students who engage with this process only because deadlines are approaching. They typically will start applying in September, October, November of their senior year, rather than proactively looking at starting in January, February of their junior year. And then when it comes to sellers and buyers, sellers are institutions that are wealthy. And so they are charging full price for students that can afford to pay, and those students are paying it. That's why we would consider that selling. Whereas buyers are willing to buy students typically by offering some sort of recruitment aid, merit aid, as he says in the book, which is a way of enticing students to attend. One of the things at the end of this book that I found so striking was he switched over the conversation to a college counselor's office, a high school guidance counselor's office. And there are students just sort of trickling into this college counselor and saying, I got to talk to you about financial aid. So these are kids that have gotten in and they've gotten their packages, and the packages are impossible to understand. And this counselor is trying to help them make sense of it and understand whether they can ask for more and how. And it's just, my reaction to that was, what guidance counselor has that kind of information, that expertise to be able to unpack these financial aid packages that are so complicated? And are these students actually understanding the full scope of this information? And it was pretty amazing, like the number of families where the student gets into their top choice, and then all of a sudden they have this conversation to say, we can't afford this. What about your second choice or your third choice? Which is I don't think a lot of families really think about that eventuality.
That always makes me crazy. I know this is you, Shannon, but I just have to say, like, when I was applying to college, my mom sat me down. I lived in California. I grew up there. She said, you're applying to the UCs. I can afford the UCs. I know you want a smaller college. I'll let you apply to smaller colleges, but it might not work out financially. We're going to apply for financial aid. Maybe it'll work out. Maybe it won't. You need to find a UC that you're happy with. And I was like, okay. I mean, I knew the deal going forward. And believe me, I was not a kid who was like, yes, mother. I mean, like so anyway.
Yeah. And they actually, I was just, if you saw me looking down, if you're watching on video, I was looking on my phone because I made a note of this, that I don't think I wrote the exact quote, but to paraphrase, he said that parents suppress their financial anxieties so that their child's potential can take precedence, which I think goes on in so many households, whether it's sort of conscious or not. Whatever worries parents might have about the paying for it side of things, they make it secondary to my child's potential. This is their dream school. This is what they need to succeed, is the perception. When in fact, he shows plenty of evidence in this book. And in fact, I wrote a blog post about it for anyone who wants to check out our blog at blog.getintocollege.com. I have to throw in a promo. I'm good at that kind of thing. Yep, you're welcome. But I wrote a blog post on the same thing about, does where you go to college matter? And there are plenty and plenty of studies that confirm that the level of selectivity of the college you attend has, on average, no bearing on your income, which is of course the easiest thing to measure. You can talk about all the things that a college education gives you, but on your income post-graduation, on average, it has no effect. There are certain subpopulations where it seems like it does have an effect. For students coming from less educated household, underrepresented minority students, it may actually give you some boost to your income later in life to have attended a very selective college. For the typical driver family, educated upper middle class, it actually makes no difference at all on average.
Yeah. And he had mentioned, I think at one point there was this quote of parents seeing college as the first opportunity to sort of maximize the untapped potential of their high school students, that high schools aren't able to sort of launch students into a successful path, but there are very specific sets of colleges that can do that. And I love you sort of bringing it back to that conversation about, parents sort of saying, well, I'm willing to sacrifice financially so that you can have this experience. But the evidence, the data often show that, well, it's not about where you go. It's about how you go to school. I think that's a phrase that he uses here. It's about what you bring to the table when you get there. And I think students often recognize that much later when they are students, when they're a sophomore or a junior in college, they start to recognize that the opportunities they can take advantage of are opportunities that come to them because of who they are, much more than where they go to school. I wonder how we can get people to better understand that earlier in the process. Students often have this sort of narrow focus of 20 to 30 schools that they are even willing to consider. And we know that there are hundreds of schools that might fit a particular student, even a top student, where they could be very, very successful. How, Sally, we try and have these conversations with families every year, and we're starting to get into the point where students, new juniors, are going to start to think about their college lists. How can we have these conversations, and what can we do to help families better understand that there is a much wider set of possibilities with colleges than they think there may be?
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's helpful. Some families are going to kind of listen to you as an expert, I've found. And the fact that I mean, honestly, I'm kind of like an admissions grandma at this point, because I started.
No, come on, Sally.
Well, I started working in admission. I'm not as old as Royal, like that one consultant he talks about in the book,
Right.
But I started working in admissions back in 1992. So it has been a while. But like as much sort of, I always feel like as much enthusiasm as I can give them, because the more colleges that we are all able to visit, and we can say specific things about what we've seen that college offer, I think that tends to be really helpful. Like, I mean, I always start out by saying, well, I think that college is great. Here's some things that really stood out to me about it. And that helps with some families. But then there are other families that are like, nope, this is not what I've heard. This is not what my friends talk about at cocktail parties. And then the kind of second path that I take is trying to find as much data as possible. And this is one of the reasons why I really like the National Science Foundation list of baccalaureate origins of doctorates
future
in
doctorates,
future doctorates in math and science. So, it ranks schools just by sheer numbers, in which case UC Berkeley is always at the top. Makes sense. Berkeley's a huge school. Then I think it's Cornell, et cetera. But what's cool, right, is that then you see like University of Illinois is on that list. But if you do it by yield, and of course I love this because I went to Reed, and Reed.
Me too, Sally. This is one of my favorite pieces of data. Yeah,
exactly. Reed is very high on this list. So, even though Reed doesn't even have engineering, Reed is like usually number 4, like after MIT, Harvey Mudd, and Caltech are always up in the top. Yeah. And then
number
Reed
1
is
for
often
biology.
Yeah. Reed is often like right there. But what's cool about that is it's not just about boosting my own school, I promise. Like, I love pointing out that places like New Mexico Tech is on that list. New Mexico Tech and Socorro. I am really pretty sure New Mexico Tech is a buyer. Like New Mexico Tech is giving major scholarships. They're in a town that I've been to. It's fine, but Southern New Mexico is not Northern New Mexico. It's not like a beautiful, beautiful place. It's a great school. And somehow look at what they do with their students.
Yeah.
Like, actually, if I think there are schools that do change students who go to them. Lauren Pope talks about them in his book, Colleges That Change Lives. And I think that a school like New Mexico Tech is clearly one of those schools, because they take students that probably are not as strong as the students at getting an engineering degree at a place like Columbia, right? And yet those students go on to do amazing things and get PhDs in high numbers. So I love being able to highlight colleges like that people haven't heard of.
The thing that I think is just, it's so interesting, because I think that when people engage with this college process, it's sort of like this river that's moving. And then at certain points, you have families that jump on and then they jump off, right? And so they haven't fully engaged with the full scope of everything that's going on. And they're choosing to come into it with a very limited amount of knowledge. And I feel that even for myself, when I worked at Reed, I very much felt like a particular kind of college experience, like the one Reed had, was better for every student. And I went out and recruited student with that mindset. But at that point, I had only ever gone to Reed, and I'd only ever worked in the Reed admission office. And when I came here to College Coach and I started encountering more families with different kinds of priorities, I talked to my colleagues on the finance side. I saw things about, discount rate. I saw things about loan indebtedness. My perspective changed really dramatically. Where if I were still at Reed and you said, well, where should your kids go to college? I would have said, well, Reed or a place like it. But now I say, well, University of Oregon's great. They've got a terrific honors college. That's my public university. And so your perspective really changes the more information you have. And I think what's really interesting about Selingo's book is he's got a lot more information because he's done all of this research. And I would love families to trust those of us who've done the research and had the experience and therefore see it from a broader perspective than them who are sort of coming into a process for a very narrow window of time and looking for a particular outcome. We have a lot to talk about here. We're going to take a pause. I think what we want to talk about next is early decision. And it's a really great sort of continuation of this conversation because the implicit message with early decision is that there is a one best college for anyone, which I think that the philosophy of this book would push against. So if you want to hear our conversation about ED as it relates to who gets in and why, don't touch that radio dial. We'll be right back.